I think that's kind of like one of the common misconceptions is that goddesses were all about fertility. They weren't. They were about warfare as much as they were about nurturing.
Well, Dan, we are very fortunate today to have a renowned guest on the show, someone with whom you, Dan, are pretty familiar. Why don't you introduce our guest and tell our friends listening and viewing who she is and what she's all about?
Of course. So today I'm very happy to have my former dissertation supervisor, Francesca Stavrakopoulou, professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Religion at Exeter University, former head of the Department of Theology and Religion, which is still the name on my doctoral dissertation. Welcome to the show, Francesca, or Professor Stavrakopoulou, pardon me. How has your day been? I hear it's a little hectic over there right now in the academic world.
Yeah, hi. It's really nice to be talking to friendly people. Things are kind of chaotic in the academic world, and we've been having various strikes and whatnot. So yeah, but it's very nice to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you.
I know that one of your priorities is the welfare, the well-being of your students, and I think I've met one or two of your students in the past, as well as some colleagues of yours there in Exeter. I hope everybody is hopeful about the outcome of the discussions there, but it sounds like there's a lot of work left to do.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think, one of the things about academia, particularly in the UK, is that a lot of government funding has gone towards what we call STEM subjects, so science and technology and engineering. And it makes things harder for those of us in the humanities, particularly those of us who focus on ancient cultures, to kind of justify our existence sometimes. But, as we know, things like the Bible remain hugely relevant culturally. I mean, whether we believe it or not, the Bible is a cultural icon and remains this incredibly important collection of texts to which various people refer. And they also use these texts to beat other people over the head with. So yeah, it's kind of hard sometimes, when you're trying to explain to your paymasters just quite how important this work can be.
Yeah, we have similar concerns here with the corporatization of higher education, and ironically, the Bible is frequently embedded in the very ideological foundations of those movements towards that corporatization,
right.
Which seeks to try to invalidate some of the research that you and I and others are doing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Francesca. You briefly mentioned that, you said the Bible's important whether you're a believer or not. You're not a believer, is that right?
Yeah. I'm never have been, and I never will be.
Do you find pushback in the world of biblical scholarship because of your atheism?
That's a really interesting question because, I would say that most scholars in my field are religious in some way or another. We have a lot of Jewish colleagues, a lot of Christian colleagues, and every kind of flavor therein, people that are studying these ancient texts and cultures and archaeological sites. But more often than not, people tend not to, I say that. There's no reason why somebody who has a religious commitment or investment in these texts can't produce good scholarship. They absolutely can, and they absolutely do. On the other hand, sometimes I think some people have found me unsettling or are a bit uncomfortable with me because I am quite outspoken about my atheism, but primarily because I'm often on a public stage, or I've found myself on this public platform, and people will always assume, oh, you study the Bible, you must be religious. And when they realize that I'm not, they just can't understand it. So people think, oh, were you religious and you lost your faith through the academic study of the Bible, which is not the case at all. I never have been religious. I was just really interested in these texts. Or other people kind of feel that somehow the Bible doesn't belong to me. How dare I kind of ask these questions of these texts or interrogate these particular traditions? What right have I got? But we all have a right to these texts. As I said, the Bible is a cultural icon, whether we like it or not, and it shapes and continues to shape so many of our cultural preferences and assumptions and our sort of tics and twitches about the world. And so we absolutely, I think it's our responsibility to engage with these texts, particularly if you're coming from a personal perspective that may be non-religious or secular.
Yeah, all you have to do is look at the fact that the two hosts of this podcast are both of European origin with Hebrew names. Two Daniels, you know what I mean, to know how impactful the Bible has been across society. So it seems it's definitely worthy, I suppose, of study, whether you're a believer or not. But I do imagine that the concept of theology, because that's a different study than what you do, right? Your study is not theological in nature.
No, I mean, it intersects with a lot of theological ideas. So, theology is basically talk about God, ultimately. But within academia, if you're described as a theologian, that generally means that you are interested in sort of kind of theories about the nature of God and the ways in which that impacts your understanding of why and how the world is, and our relationships with the divine. It assumes the reality, if you like, of the divine. So, for a lot of us, scholars of religion, if you call them a theologian, a lot of us would like just bristle.
It's an insult.
Yeah, to be frank, yeah, I find it kind of insulting. But that's not to say that theologians are doing incredibly important work as well, particularly when it comes to setting certain doctrinal positions, say within Christianity, within their kind of cultural, historical context. That's really important. Things like, notions of the Trinity emerged within a very particular cultural dynamic and time. And we can understand why those particular theories came about because of the cultural context in which they were being debated. But yeah, I am definitely not a theologian, but I do engage with theological ideas because those are the ideas that are so often retrojected back into these ancient texts or retrojected back onto archaeological artifacts. And so I quite often find myself sort of trying to argue that we need to disentangle these later confessional interpretations of this material from their likely original historical contexts and framings, if you like.
I know I'm frequently called a theologian as well, and part of it is because that degree that I got says theology and religion.
Yeah,
and I have to remind people that's just the name of the department.
Yeah,
you're in the and religion part, not the theology part.
Exactly, but that's a really good example. It's a hangover from, particularly within European academia, the ways in which the only time you really got to study these texts, these biblical texts, was, if you were doing theology, and you were doing theology because you were probably a priest. And so, it kind of reflects that much older heritage and legacy of what the kind of scholarly inquiry into the Bible was all about. It was primarily performed by religious people, whether they were rabbis or priests or whatever. And they were usually men, obviously.
Yeah, obviously.
Well, and that's an interesting point too. Sorry, Dan, I don't mean to cut you off, but I do want you, Francesca, to talk a little bit about the what it's like being a woman in biblical scholarship, because it seems like that too is probably unusual, or at very least could be treated differently.
Yeah,
have you found that that's the case?
Have you seen the internet? Yeah, of course I have. I mean, it's something that has being othered in various ways has followed me around my career ever since I did my doctorate. And I think it's not just because I'm a woman. There are lots of women in academia now, but like in every other aspect of academia, women are still, like people of color, like people of a certain sort of socioeconomic class, there are all sorts of ways in which people are othered and marginalized within our disciplines and within academic structures themselves. So, for example, the gender pay gap is still, live and kicking. When you look at academic pay structures, women effectively stop being paid for doing the same job as men in early November in any given year. I mean, that's the kind of way it works out. So, yeah, being a woman is still different You're still treated differently, I think, in some ways. But being a woman in biblical studies, yeah, absolutely, that is hard. And I think it's harder than being an atheist in biblical studies. Personally, I found it to be harder because, I mean, I've spoken and written about this in the past, but I think women are judged far more in terms of what they look like and how they present themselves than men are. And rather than people paying attention to a woman's scholarship and her teaching and her publications, people automatically, quite often, and they're normally men, not always, but normally men, they tend to judge these scholars in terms of how they look or how they dress. And that pisses me off because it's been the case ever since. Well, yeah, but it's been the case ever since. I think there's a sense in which, a colleague of mine commented on something the other day, and she pointed out, and it was relation to somebody being unpleasant about me publicly. And she said, you never hear it said about a male scholar, oh, he only got that job because, he wears nice suits, or he only got that job because he's good looking. You never hear that ever about male scholars, but you often hear it about women. So it's not easy.
I think that's fair. Yeah. I think that's fair. Speaking of your scholarship and judging you on your scholarship, however, I think we should dive into a few of the things that you've worked on, that you've written about. Dan, you've studied up. You know the stuff.
You know me.
I know you, and I wanted to use the discussion of gender in contemporary academia as a springboard into, you've done a lot of research on sex and gender in the ancient world, as well as in ancient concepts of the divine. And I'm particularly interested in a lot of that research. Can you tell us what is unique, interesting about the divine profiles of the goddesses in ancient Southwest Asia and even in ancient Israel?
Wow. If the question is what's unique about their divine profiles, that's a really difficult question, because it's very hard to see what's unique about, say, ancient Israelite or Judahite constructs of goddesses or whatever, because these goddesses were worshipped all over ancient Southwest Asia, and quite often they're performing particular sorts of roles in common with other goddesses in neighboring societies and cultures. But one of the most important
Can I just stop you right here? I do want to point out, it's obvious, I think everyone knows that obviously no Israelites were ever worshipped any goddesses. Like, obviously there's no female gods in sort of biblical history. That couldn't be the case, right?
Yeah,
surely we know that much, right?
Yeah, you mean no Israelites apart from all the ones that the biblical writers are telling off for worshipping goddesses and apart from the goddess who's named alongside Yahweh in inscriptions. But goddesses were absolutely part and parcel of ancient Yahweh religion, and so we know we have inscriptions from the 8th century BCE, Hebrew inscriptions that refer to Yahweh and Asherah together, and most scholars are now agreed that this seems to index particular religious assumptions that Yahweh and Asherah were kind of like a divine pair, and Asherah played a role in mediating, in particular, divine blessings from Yahweh onto certain individuals and back again. So she was kind of like, she wasn't like the first lady. I don't want to give that impression. She wasn't like the first lady of the divine kind of White House. She was an important goddess in her own right. And we know that from other examples, other ancient texts, older texts that talk about the same goddess. So texts from Ugarit, so a late Bronze Age city-state on the coast of what is now, the Mediterranean coast of what is now Syria. And there, she's known as Atiratu or Atheras, and she is the wife of the high god Ale. And she has a really important role in a lot of these mythological texts. I mean, she really is a power broker between Ale and different deities like Baal and Anat. But she also seems to have played an important role for certain sort of high status elite worshippers as well. We get some great stories in these myths about high status women sort of almost kind of mimicking this goddess in certain sorts of ways. So yeah, this was an important goddess, and she seems to have been a really ancient goddess. We find her under various names, worshipped all over ancient Southwest Asia, particularly the Levant area. So yeah, goddesses were important, but the main kind of assumption that people often make about these goddesses, which I think is completely wrong-headed, is the idea that somehow these were fertility goddesses. They were all concerned about childbirth and sort of sexual kind of allure and attraction and fecundity and agricultural fertility. That wasn't the case in most of these texts that we have, including biblical texts. Fertility is very much it's very frequently cast as a masculine male attribute of the divine as opposed to a female. So quite often you get female deities who are responsible for kind of shaping new life in the womb, or kind of overlooking, not always, but overlooking sort of breastfeeding and lactation and sort of childcare and nurturing. And those sorts of roles are then expanded to adult worshippers, if you like. But more often than not, it's the male or masculine deities that are particularly associated with conception, even opening and closing wombs, both animal and human, and with kind of, with being these fertile deities who are particularly responsible often for sexual allure as well. So I think that's kind of like one of the common misconceptions, is that goddesses were all about fertility. They weren't. They were about warfare as much as they were about nurturing.
And the symbol of the bull is something that is associated with male deities that frequently has to do with ferocity, but just as frequently, if not more so, with fecundity, with this idea of being fertile. So we have kind of intersecting but different roles that some of the male and female deities are playing. And it seems to me that there are indications in the Hebrew Bible that the God of Israel has appropriated some of those roles. Some of the imagery that is used in referencing the God of Israel seems like it would fit more comfortably within an ancient goddess role. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So in some of the prophetic texts, we find texts like in Hosea and Isaiah where God is kind of describing himself. Yahweh's describing himself as a midwife. This is a God who kind of helps to birth, if you like, even the chaos monster in the book of Job, and it kind of wraps him in swaddling bands, which is a really fabulous text towards the end of the book of Job. But in some of the prophetic books, as I said, Hosea and Isaiah, Jeremiah, this is a God who acts as a midwife. He takes the kind of newborn Israel from the womb and places the child on this kind of anonymous mother's breast, and he oversees the kind of breastfeeding. He acts as a midwife. And so he takes on a lot of these roles that probably were originally particularly associated with divine, feminine divine beings. And it's a part of that kind of gradual appropriation of these other deities' roles as what was originally a pantheon, an ancient Israelite and Judahite pantheon, is gradually reduced and reduced and reduced, so that Yahweh is prioritized over and above all these other divine beings within the broader heavenly household, and to the point where he eventually kind of either takes on all of these portfolios, if you like, of care for himself, and some of these other divine beings are either kind of excised from the heavenly household, or they're kind of relegated and they become what's later known as angels or divine messengers. Yeah. So it's a really interesting shift, but it's not necessarily representative of reality. I mean, we know that there seems to have been a shift within Jerusalem and perhaps in Babylon as well, among Yahweh worshipping communities there in the 6th to the 5th century, towards this kind of prioritization of Yahweh. But, equally, we know that in the 5th century BCE, on the island of Elephantine in the Nile in Egypt, there was a Yahweh temple was being refurbished, and this Yahweh was being worshipped alongside, at least one other goddess. So, it's not the Hebrew Bible, and the information that we can kind of glean from it isn't necessarily representative of a broader trend within Yahweh worship. It's quite particular.
Yeah. And we have, I think the name of the deity there's a compound name, Anat Yahu, is the goddess there. And now there's another compound name that some people associate with the divine feminine, and that's El Shaddai. based on the argument that Shaddai comes from the word for breasts. And in Genesis 49, we've got this idea of El Shaddai associated with the blessings of the womb and the blessings of breasts. Where do you land on the origins of the Shaddai title?
Yeah, I mean, it's always really hard trying to kind of grasp anything meaningful from possible etymologies, I think, and kind of trying to dissect the word that way. Yeah, so one theory is that the word comes from a root meaning breasts, equally that maps onto roots that could mean mountains. And so, scholars have produced some interesting imaginative work on the shapes of mountains as that look like breasts. But I'm more persuaded. Yeah, I know.
We have a mountain range. There's the Tetons. Is a mountain range that is based on the same. So it wouldn't be unheard of.
It's not unheard of. And it makes a lot of sense because quite often, the earthly realm is often personified as this kind of primeval feminine, and kind of the idea that the earth is this kind of birthing female body. It makes sense. But in the case of that title, El Shaddai, I'm more inclined to go with the other kind of interpretation of that name. I think it probably means something like Ale of the wilderness or the steppe region. Yeah. There seems to be more kind of evidence for that usage of the term. But even so, you're absolutely right. In Genesis 49, we have got this kind of series of divine blessings where you have an appeal to El Shaddai, you have an appeal to either my ancestral God or, my divine ancestor. You have an appeal to the divine rock, which seems to have been a really important, very early title of probably a masculine deity. And you also have an appeal to this kind of divine being, for blessings on breast and womb, which some people have argued that word pair is are titles or epithets for a goddess. Mark S. Smith argues that this is a title of Asherah. So, yeah, we have traces of these goddesses in our texts, which is exciting.
And I think I know one of the very first TikTok videos that I ever made that got over 1 million views was responding to somebody who was expressing frustration with a headline from an article that was an interview with you over a decade ago about God's wife being edited out of the Bible. And so these are some of the potential vestigial references to the divine feminine, and other scholars argue maybe Deuteronomy 33:2, where it says a fiery law in many translations now, but it could be very easily reconstructed to say that Adonai came forth with Asherah at his right hand.
Yeah, which is a translation that I really like. I think it's got an awful lot to be said for it. I mean, it's interesting that people do get upset sometimes about the idea that God could have once had a wife. And I think, that says a lot more about our own cultural anxieties about the nature of the divine and divine sexuality, divine sort of gender than it does anything else. I mean, there's a big debate going on at the moment in the mainstream press here because the Church of England has said that it's going to consider having a debate about whether it should change God's pronouns in prayers and various other things. So God will become they rather than he, will become parent rather than father. And people are getting really worked up about this. But I mean, these ancient texts that we have in the Bible, they are always being overturned, reinterpreted, overwritten in ancient contexts as well as in the contemporary context. And so, I mean, I don't have a problem with it particularly, but I mean, very much, this is a God who is very much gendered in masculine terms within the Hebrew Bible. And I think we need to recognize that.
Yeah, and I know that something that I'm fond of saying is that everybody is negotiating with the text in one way or another, and this is just another example of ways that we try to make the text more meaningful or more useful to us. And we've got folks who are out there who are upset about the idea of God having a wife, but will vehemently insist that God is male, which means something. And so, there are other ways that we can upset people in the audience as well. You wrote your dissertation under the supervision of the inimitable John Barton at Oxford, and this had a lot to do with the question of human sacrifice, child sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible. It seems like there's quite a bit of discussion going on these days around that question of child sacrifice. There seems to be a shift in the scholarship, including the meaning of the word Moloch, and whether this is a reference to a deity who received child sacrifice, or if this is just a generic noun that refers to a specific type of sacrifice. Can you tell us where you see the scholarship heading, where you land on some of those discussions?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I don't want to kind of give away too much about about my age, because I feel about 100 today. But yeah, when I wrote my dissertation, it was back in the early 2000s, and child sacrifice had kind of become a more sort of provocative topic in scholarship, sort of in the mid 80s, and then no one had really talked about it since then. But in the mid 80s, these two important works were published, one by a scholar called John Day and the other by a scholar called George Hyder, and they are both arguing that the term Molech in the Hebrew Bible absolutely refers to, is the name of a deity. And they both claimed independently, and I think incorrectly, that this god Molech could be found in some of these texts from this place that I mentioned before, from Ugarit. Their arguments, in my opinion, and as I argued in my thesis, don't stack up at all. But the reason why a lot of these scholars in particular were keen to defend the biblical portrayal of a character called Molech is, I think, because it distances Yahweh from the suggestion, the implication in these texts that these children were being sacrificed to him and not to a foreign, abominable deity, that somehow child sacrifice is a kind of a foreign import, a kind of a corruption of a much purer form of religion. Now, whether or not child sacrifice happened is really difficult to assess. Archaeologically, we have no evidence for the sorts of ritualized burning of very young babies, children, and young animals that we have from comparative sites across the Phoenician and Punic worlds. So that's quite difficult. We don't have direct, clear archaeological evidence. Now, those sites in these Phoenician and Punic areas, so basically, this is where the argument about who is Molech really, this is where it comes from, because some of these sites where you have huge precincts that are clearly set apart from other sorts of mortuary sites and burial places, they seem to be very different. They've got all sorts of things going on within these particular precincts, but what they do have are the charred remains of babies and very young animals interred in little urns and then buried. And quite often you have a stone memorial marker erected over the top of it. And sometimes these things have inscriptions. So Carthage is one of our best tested sites. We've got hundreds and hundreds of these burnt baby remains. That's not a sentence I say every day. And then, but these inscriptions occasionally seem to suggest that this particular practice is a type of offering. So, and the term mulk, so from the roots MLK, seems to be a technical term for a particular type of offering, perhaps and quite often these babies in Carthage were being kind of dedicated or offered up in honor of the god Baal Hamon and his consort Tanit. So in 1935, a brilliant scholar called Otto Eitzfeldt published a thesis, a dissertation, in which he argued that this term MLK in the Carthaginian inscriptions, meaning a type of sacrifice, is cognate with the term MLK that we find in Hebrew Bible texts, which within ancient Greek translations of the text have tended to be pronounced Moloch. In the Masoretic text, it's often pronounced Molech. But Eitzfeldt argued that no, it's the same term. And so this is really a type of sacrifice, not the name of a foreign monstrous god to whom the children are being sacrificed. And if that's the case, well, then which deity is associated with the burning of babies in these biblical texts? Mm-hmm. It's Yahweh.
Yeah.
So yeah, people kind of get upset about that.
we see even Ezekiel seeming to acknowledge this in chapter 20, speaking on behalf of God, saying, I gave you commandments that were not good, that decimated you, compelled you to cross your children over the fire, or something like that, which is one attempt to account for what's going on in likely Exodus 22. It's verse 29 in the English and verse 28 in the Hebrew, where God says, and the firstborn of your children you will give to me, and you will do the same for your oxen and your sheep.
Yeah, and there's a really nice, interesting, when you look at the language there, that kind of switch from singular to plural, where it's kind of like, on the 8th day, you shall give him to me. It's this real sense that this is about the child, and the child is to be treated in exactly the same way as the oxen and the sheep, which is to be sacrificed. But then we have, that's a regulation concerning the firstborn, and the extent to which, the relationship between this mulk practice and the firstborn sacrifice, the extent to which those are related is interesting. I think probably the mulk sacrifice, I argued in my first book that this was a specialization of the firstborn, a royal specialization of the firstborn sacrifice. But, we have a lot of other biblical traditions in which it's no problem at all for Yahweh to command, the sacrifice of your children. I mean, Abraham and Isaac is in Genesis 22 is a perfect example. And there, the sacrifice is halted, but Abraham is not blessed for refusing to sacrifice Isaac. He's blessed for his willingness to do so. Equally, the story of Jephthah's daughter in Judges 11, where you have a Yahwistic warrior who basically offers up a vow and says, Yahweh, if you let me win this war, I will offer up to you the first thing that runs out of the house to greet me. And lo and behold, it's his beloved daughter, the same term that's used of Isaac, beloved, and the same term that's used of Jesus, who also is, in some interpretations, sacrificed by his father. And Jephthah's daughter comes running out of the house, and Jephthah offers him up. No comment at all from Yahweh that this is a bad thing, or that you've misunderstood, or, how could you do this? It's just like, yeah, it happened. We've got these kinds of very positive kind of portrayals of the efficacy of child sacrifice, that this is something that brings blessing within a Yahwistic context. So it's a really interesting topic, because it unsettles as well our own cultural preferences, our own ideas of what a child is. But obviously it also, this notion of child sacrifice also underlies very early Christian interpretations of the execution of Jesus. He is the beloved son who is killed. John Levinson wrote a fantastic book back in the 90s about the kind of these links between child sacrifice within ancient Jewish tradition and early Christian traditions. So there's something very disturbing, though, about the notion of a father, a divine father, who will willingly sacrifice his child.
Yeah.
What does that say about parenthood?
It makes the Lamb of God metaphor within Christianity more interesting. I think a lot of people are enjoy that metaphor and make a lot of use of it without thinking hard about what that says about how Jesus is functioning.
And things like, and some of the Psalms, the Lord is my shepherd. That's a horrific image. I mean, because this is about the cultivation and almost the commodification, if you like, of a living being in order for it to be destroyed for, its various products.
Personhood, parentage, these things, the frameworks were much different anciently than they are today, but we still feel compelled to retroject our own thinking onto the ancient world and think they had to have felt the same way about these things anciently that we do today.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that, I know, Francesca, in your work, you've often cited the Bible as an imperfect historical text, as a text that we can't rely on as being reliable for historical facts. But I love that you're pointing out also that even though the Bible itself talks plenty about child sacrifice, we don't have the archaeological evidence for it, at least in that context. I think that's fascinating. No. I think it could be wrong about itself in a good way? ? Like maybe they didn't do the awful thing that the Bible says that they did do? ?
Yeah, but that's the thing about archaeology is that, so on the child sacrifice thing, there are archaeological excavations that have found similar sorts of urns with burnt remains and sort of stela erected over them in what is now the modern day, in what is today the state of Israel. So that is interesting. So, date to the right kind of time. So it does suggest that this kind of cremation or ritual burning of what wasn't alien to the biblical writers, if you imagine that they're kind of working in Jerusalem, say in the 5th century or whatever. But archaeologically speaking, it's really hard because, we can't go and dig up Jerusalem. With the Molech text, there's very much this insistence that this is happening in the Kidron Valley in Jerusalem. And, these valleys were natural. This was an entryway into the underworld. That's the way in which these valleys were understood outside of Jerusalem. And so, you do get, we've got loads of burial grounds, very ancient burial grounds there now. But you can't go digging up Jerusalem. I mean, equally, you can't go digging up Temple Mount to find the remains of the first temple, the Solomon's temple. I mean, you can't, because it's just, A, it's a modern thriving city, and B, it's also one of those cities that is hugely contested in terms of ownership, authority, access, within lots of different communities. So politically and socially and culturally, it would just be awful to try and excavate, obviously. But that's the thing. So archaeologically, we only have access to the places we're able to dig legally and ethically. And I have to say that, quite often a lot of digs in those territories that we understand as modern day Israel and in the Palestinian occupied territories, sometimes those digs aren't ethical to a certain degree. But, we only have access to sites in physical ways and in sort of politically mandated ways. So who knows what's there? And, you can only really dig when you know what you're looking for as well. So things like, archaeologists, particularly those of us who work on the Bible, archaeologists always used to focus on urban centers, like the big cities. Who are these people building these great cities? And they completely overlooked the majority of the ancient Iron Age population who lived out in the countryside. And so it's only been the last kind of 30 years or so that people have actually been paying attention to the majority of these ancient populations and their material circumstances and lives, by digging in places that weren't necessarily these major urban centers at all. So archaeologically speaking, it's hard. It's not a perfect science, archaeology.
Yeah, the accident of preservation has a lot to do with what we can find when we can go dig, because we're looking for something. And I think it's been such a fascinating turn towards looking at more domestic contexts and trying to reconstruct the materiality of the everyday life. Anciently, I think that tells us so much more about lived religion, if we can refer to religion anciently, than it does just looking at what men were in charge in the ancient world. Yeah. Now, you recently published your first trade book for a popular audience, God and Anatomy, and I have one of the UK versions, which I know you understand has the much better cover. And your book won the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize for Best Nonfiction Book on a Historical Subject, so congratulations for that. And I know it was in the running for some other prizes as well. Can you tell us what questions you were seeking to address when you wrote this book? What drove you to write on God's body and corporeality and how that influenced the conceptualization of the divine and how people lived their ideologies anciently?
Yeah, I think the question the question that I had, the reason why I went to university in the first place to study, I did what was known as a theology degree at Oxford. And the question that, I was really interested in religion because, when I was a kid, I was given a picture book Bible and I was looking at, like this illustration of Abraham just about to sacrifice Isaac. And I remember thinking, this is a weird thing. I remember being very struck by how strange and frightening that was. So even though I wasn't brought up religious at all, I was really interested in ancient religions. And then, I'm Greek, I'm half Greek. And so my Greek heritage was important to me. And so the myths of gods and goddesses from Greek culture was always really interesting. And I couldn't understand why, initially, the God of the Bible and Jesus in particular was treated as different from the great heroes of ancient Greek myth, who often had, one parent, they had a divine father and a human mother. So why was this Jesus guy different? But when I went to university and studied theology, I was reading, it was the first time I studied the Hebrew Bible, so what Christians called the Old Testament, and obviously what Jewish people called Tanakh. And I just couldn't get over, there was this kind of vivid images of this human-shaped, very masculine deity kind of striding around, trampling people and shouting and sitting on a throne in his temple. And I was really interested in this kind of bodily portrayal of the deity. And yet, when I would ask my lecturers and professors about it, they would always kind of dismiss it as kind of poetry or metaphor, or as, it's metaphor. I mean, everything is metaphorical to a certain degree, particularly, forgive me, Dan, but particularly when we're talking about an imaginary being, everything is ultimately kind of metaphorical. But that was where I kind of really got interested in the body of God. And I wanted to write this book because I wanted to show people that this isn't just metaphor, that actually in God's kind of original ancient, his natural cultural habitat, if you like, he was very much understood to be a corporeal deity with a human-shaped body and with male and masculine features, just like every other god and goddess, was in the ancient world. It was really normal. So I wanted kind of to put God back in his ancient cultural habitat in that sense. But I also wanted people to understand that we imagine the otherworldly, and we often imagine the otherworldly in terms of our own bodies. We navigate our way around this world because of our bodies. I mean, I don't subscribe to this very Cartesian kind of dichotomy between that we have, that our bodies are simply the vessels or shells in which our mind or our intellect or our soul or spirit is housed. And that's certainly not the way that ancient people understood what it was to be a person. And so our bodies, we are our bodies. And I think how these ancient societies interpreted certain aspects of their bodies very much framed and shaped the ways in which they imagined their gods and their gods' bodies. And so from things like, certain sorts of the heart being a cognitive organ, an intellectual organ, rather than, we tend to think of it as an emotional organ if we kind of apply any kind of cultural meaning to it. The way that the belly was understood to be the seat of certain sorts of emotions, the nose is the place of anger, the territoriality of the feet. All of these sorts of things have shaped the way in which God's portrayed in not just the Hebrew Bible, but in New Testament texts as well. And I kind of wanted to take the reader on a journey through the early history of God by kind of stripping the deity and kind of showing what this God's body was understood to be like. And it was fun to write.
It sounds like it. I listened to the audio version that you narrated, and I can tell when you're kind of giggling in the background a little bit. But
it was so hard not to do accents as well, not to do voices for God, because I do that in my lecture.
And I think you do kind of strip the deity in a somewhat literal, non-metaphoric sense. And in some of the discussions, you've got a whole section on divine genitals, which I think is going to strike some people as a little off-putting, but it's such a fascinating discussion. And I think one of the things that I've heard come up the most in people talking about this book is your discussion of Isaiah 6 and Isaiah's throne theophany that he sees in the temple. You have a different reading of what traditionally we understand to be the hem of a robe or the skirts. Could you tell us about this reading and what's in the background of this reading of God filling the temple?
It's really interesting that particular part of my book has caused such debate. I mean, particularly because I spent a lot more time in the book talking about a very similar image of the deity in Ezekiel 1, which I think is far more interesting. And I say far more about that than I do about what's happening in Isaiah 6. But in Isaiah 6, we have the prophet having this encounter. He sees Yahweh enthroned in the Jerusalem temple, and Yahweh is surrounded by, seraphim, which are these kind of monstrous, noisy, flying, burning, serpent-like creatures. And And we're told, so the Hebrew goes something like, the Lord, he saw Yahweh high and lofty, and it's normally translated as the hem of his robe filled the temple. And the term that's used there for, there's no word for robe in the Hebrew. It's literally his lower extremities. That's what the word literally means. And it's often used to talk about the edges of garments. And, sure enough, iconographically, we've got lots of images from across ancient Southwest Asia of gods and kings wearing very, double hemmed, long ankle length robes, so that's completely fine. But in my book, I sort of say there's an illusion going on here as well. So I'm not, and I use the word illusion very deliberately. Because quite often when this term is used, particularly when it's used in prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible, it often alludes to the genitals, more usually of female characters. And these are sometimes it seems to be like a goddess-like character, as we find in Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23, and it's kind of used in a very derogatory way. It's about when you have a reference to the shul of these female characters, it's because they're being stripped and genitally exposed. So there's all of this kind of stuff that's clustering around this image. So it's a very interesting image, that his shul, his lower extremities fill the temple. And I think within the context of ancient Judahite constructs of the masculinity of God, the idea of God having genitals that are so big would fill the temple is not weird at all. Particularly, I think, because I think this is probably what Ezekiel 1 is riffing off, because in Ezekiel 1, again, a prophet has this image of Yahweh enthroned on a temple. And this time, and like in Ezekiel 6, the prophet doesn't quite say everything he sees. He doesn't say, "Oh, I looked at his face and it looked like this, and his arms were like this." It's always very the deity's body is very hidden. Yeah, and what he says, he very much says this was a human-shaped being sitting on the throne, and this deity's upper body is covered by this kind of flashes of fire and flames and bright light, as is the lower half of his body. And the one body part that Ezekiel mentions is his motnaim, and he kind of navigates his kind of description of this deity's body by means of the motnaim. And it's almost as if the motnaim are exposed. And this is a term that's normally and politely rendered loins, but more appropriately refers to the front part of the body that is at the bottom of your waist and at the top of your legs, but it's the genital area. Right. And yet Ezekiel leaves this part exposed, which is really interesting. So I think those two texts, I suspect Ezekiel 1 is riffing. If Isaiah 6 is older, which most scholars would probably argue, maybe, but I think there's some kind of intertextual relationship going on between those two. And I think that one has informed the other. And so what perhaps Ezekiel 6 is alluding to and what Isaiah 6 is alluding to, I think Ezekiel 1 is rendering more explicit, but in this incredible way that kind of by revealing that part of God's body, he's almost concealing more of the body. It's a really clever text. I really like it.
Kind of revealing as it masks at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
If I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is that the TikTok generation did not invent the concept of big dick energy. Is that what?
Yeah, and my goodness, and I'm certainly not the TikTok generation, but it was definitely around when I was younger.
Well, and even you mentioned the Ugaritic text earlier. We've got things about El's hand growing large as the sea when he sees some women
beautiful
on the
young
beach.
Goddesses. Yeah.
Yes, and then this is not something that ancient, even Jewish writers were particularly uncomfortable with. We have discussions in rabbinic literature about God's genitals, including saying Adam must have been circumcised because Adam was made in the image of God.
Yeah. So their argument is very much that, if Adam's made in the image of God, they worried, was Adam made circumcised, or was he created with a foreskin? And they worried about it. And then they finally decided that absolutely Adam was created with a foreskin. He was made perfectly because he was made in the image of God. And because God is circumcised, then therefore Adam must have been circumcised too. So this idea that somehow God couldn't possibly have a penis is extraordinary. It's a modern hang-up. It's not, it's a kind of a post-biblical hang-up. rather than an ancient one.
Yeah, well, and our Victorian kind of sensitivities are governing how people feel comfortable talking about that in public, and unfortunately that comes out in a lot of the boundary maintenance that a lot of people think it's their prerogative to engage in regarding the Bible and who's allowed to talk about what in the Bible. So
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. I know you've got to get going. I appreciate you joining us and offering your thoughts on this, and congratulations on the book again. I'm sure we have more listeners in the U.S. than in the U.K., but they can find your book wherever quality books are sold, I'm sure. Anything else you'd like to share? Anything you didn't get to say that you wish I would have asked you?
No, I've really enjoyed having the conversation, and it was nice to revisit child sacrifice. I need to start. I know that sounds weird. I need to start. I've been asked to write a piece on child sacrifice, and for something that's coming out. I need to get it done later this year, and so it's been nice to kind of get my brain thinking about it again. It's been a long time. I've missed child sacrifice. What a weird thing to say, but I have.
Who doesn't miss it every now and then? Is there anything that you want where can people go to find more of your work, to find you if they're interested?
Gosh, well, I'm all over YouTube in various ways. I think you can find my BBC documentaries on YouTube in certain places. I'm on Twitter, so if you want to see what I talk about on Twitter, I'm at Prof Francesca. And you can find a lot of my academic publications on my university webpage. So just Google me. Just put my name in Google. It's quite an unusual name. It will come up.
Yeah, and you've got some stuff on academia.edu as well, don't you?
Yeah, but I keep forgetting that I have that thing. Yeah, so it's quite There's nothing new on it.
Yeah,
I keep forgetting.
If people want to access some of the scholarship, that's one way to do it conveniently. So,
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope conditions improve for the university there in the UK, and I look forward to visiting with you again out there in Exeter at some point soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.